To begin with, I must thank the HRDC Center of JNU and Professor Sanjay Bharadwaj for giving me this opportunity to talk to you on India's foreign policy. This is a big subject. It is not possible for us to exhaust it in 1 hour. Therefore, what we will do is to flag some of the important issues, and then we can continue to probe them in our various studies. We must first understand what a foreign policy is, and I think so far as our understanding of foreign policy is concerned, it is the manifestation of a state's interest, its anxieties, its aspirations, its assets at the international level. And therefore, we find that there are two critical elements of that. One is the state, and the second is the international environment. The character of the state therefore becomes very important, not in the Marxian sense, but in terms of state's capabilities, state's concerns, state's priorities, what kind of leadership is there, what kind of a system is there. That gets reflected in the state's interaction at the international level in terms of the environment which exists outside, both at the regional level as also at the international level. Now, these two parameters are extremely critical for understanding foreign policy, and we will see that there are various dimensions of the interaction between these two, which manifest also in India's foreign policy. We will come and see that there are 4 major phases through which the foreign policy has evolved. But before we come to that, we must also underline the key determinants of India's foreign policy. The first key determinant is, of course, the history and culture, the civilization. A country, a nation is made out of its own inheritance, and that inheritance is composed by the historical and cultural sense. India has been a plural, an inclusive, and an open society all along. In fact, it is very interesting to note that Indian nationalism or Indian nationality or national identity is based upon huge diversity rather than homogeneity, and this is where it contrasts with Europe. It had extensive engagement with Asia for centuries together, based primarily on 2 factors. One was commerce, the other was culture. There were no military expeditions which India had ever taken to the neighboring countries, perhaps with an exception of the Cholas, and that to protect their trade. It was not to grab territories or control other peoples. And this was a process which went on for centuries, and this is where the Indian civilization and culture was very strongly, very extensively spread into Southeast Asia, also in the West Asia, a large section of the Asian countries. Now, this is where it's synthesized, and we find that various streams of Indian civilization got mixed up to create what you call an identity based upon diversity. Then we also had a colonial past, and that colonial past had to be struggled against by non-violent, independent struggle, and we had long drawn a legal exercise through which we could push the British out. Unfortunately, when they left, they divided the country, and the partition scars, which disrupted millions of people, became a very critical aspect. So all this gets into the inheritance of what you call history and civilization, which has impacted India's foreign policy. You may recall this kind of a long narration in Nehru's Discovery of India. Nehru's also another book called Glimpses of World History. You can also see the old Congress resolutions where on various international situations, even before India became independent, India had taken a position, though as a party, but India had taken a position, and this is very important, which continued to reflect and influence India's foreign policy for a long time. The second important determinant is the strategic placement of India. India is very critically placed in the Indian Ocean. India has 1.3, 1.4 billion people. It has 3 million square kilometers of territory, 15,000 kilometers of land borders, and 750 kilometers of coastal line. It is both continental as well as maritime. The maritime aspect often is forgotten in understanding India's foreign policy, particularly not only the islands like Lakshadweep, but I think Andaman and Nicobar is a very critical extension of India, which takes us much closer to Southeast Asia, almost a neighbor of Thailand and Indonesia, which is often not remembered. Now, this is a very important aspect. India is also, if you look at the map, India is also very central to Asia, both West Asia as well as Southeast Asia. And today, when this is being evolved into a new concept of Indo-Pacific, we find that India's critical location and critical position there is of great significance. Then, as I said, we had a colonial past, almost 250 years. And we found that during this period also, India was redefined in terms of integrating administratively, economically, in terms of governance. But it caused many other difficulties. And one of the major difficulties was that there was a disconnect with our Asian neighbors. And the entire economic direction of India's engagement with Asia was changed in the sense that the British wanted to profit by trade in Asia, and therefore India started going poorer. Then there is a map which will tell you how India is very centrally located. So these are the two or three major determinants which we must keep it in mind while understanding India's foreign policy. Now, these also gave, when India became independent, what I can call are the four major deficits. And these deficits have continued to influence India's foreign policy, because India as a state and India as a leadership has tried to overcome these deficits, which in a way India as a state had to struggle against these deficits to have its impact on international affairs. The first deficit, as I said, was the colonial disconnect, which was brought out during the British period. And this disconnect broke our commercial and civilizational links, which we had with whole of Asia, both on the west as well as east. It also broke the economic disconnect, but it created some new connects also. And one of the connect was, of course, diaspora, that many of the Indians went there and settled down in some of these countries because of the colonial economy, which was promoted by the British imperial interests. Second major deficit is the security deficit, and this is where I find that we find that when India became independent, it almost became independent with two of its neighbors which were of adversarial character. Pakistan was one country which even in 47 started a conflict, and we had the Kashmir war imposed upon us by Pakistan. But secondly, on the other side, China also moved militarily into Tibet, and India's interest in Tibet and Xinjiang had to be withdrawn. And the approach of the Indian leadership towards China was far more cautious because of various other international constraints, particularly the Cold War, where the West had really left India on its own and to a very large extent marginalized. So we had to deal with China in a different way. Also, in terms of defense and economic matters, we could not challenge China at that time. Whatever the reasons, we will discuss it. The Chinese presence had to be coped with, but there was always a kind of a caution in dealing with China, because it had militarily walked into Tibet, and by militarily walking into Tibet, China really became a new and a closer. Otherwise, China was a distant neighbor because Tibet was the immediate neighbor for us. Now, these two neighbors inflicted in a matter of a decade and a half, almost, you can say 2 decades at the most, 50s and 60s, almost 3 wars on India. The Kashmir War of 47-48, 1962 war with China imposed on us, and 1965 the Pakistan imposed that war. And later on also in 1999 we had conflict again with Pakistan, which intruded in Kargil, and we find periodic incursions by China, which has now taken a very serious shape in terms of standoff in Ladakh and in particularly Galwan Valley. So we had this security deficit so far as neighbors were concerned, which were a major concern of major worry about India's security. And internationally, the Cold War almost marginalized India, because in Cold War they opted to have Pakistan on their side, and that marginalization was not very conducive to India's own relations with various Asian countries. As a result of this, in international organizations also, India was not promoted, though we had our voice heard on critical issues like disarmament, critical issues of nuclear control, critical issues of great power rivalry, on human rights, on democracy and peace issues. But this security concern continued to be there. Subsequently, this security concern has taken new forms, and one of the forms is we are facing terrorism, and foreign policy has got to gear to deal with terrorism. The third major deficit, to my mind, was the developmental deficit. If you recall, India had dominated global economy from 1st century up to the 18th century. And this domination continued in cooperation with China. In fact, up to the 15th century, India had a greater share of global economy, exceeding 25%, 26-27% roughly. And China was lagging behind, but with India in terms of the dominance of the global economy. After 15th century up to 18th century, China took a lead. China was contributing more. By, I think, 1820, we were contributing almost 21% of the global GDP. But contrast this with 1947, we were nowhere. Therefore, from 1820, the British exploitation, there are various forms in which scholars have written about it, like deindustrialization of India. And the whole direction of the trade was such that India suffered. And we were known for what you call the Hindu rate of growth, were not exceeding more than 3% of the economy. And this economic disadvantage weighed quite heavily on India's foreign policy. And you will find that in the early years of India's foreign policy, economy did not really come as a major aspect, major dimension. The fourth deficit, as I would say, is of status deficit. And this status deficit is in terms of position of India in global institutions. As I said, we were not promoted in international organizations, and that one example was the UN Security Council. There is a long debate about it, whether the West offered UN Security Council seat to India and India was not willing to take it. Leaving that debate apart, the fact remains that the 5 permanent powers never wanted anybody else to come, and they wanted to control United Nations and its global decisions by themselves. And they did not want countries which was very big and newly emerged enthusiastic like India to come and play any significant role. So they had their own reservations. But despite that, let me underline here that India did play a role at the international level. even with this status deficit without really getting. Now things have changed. For the current moment, for instance, we have been for last couple of decades, we have been struggling to get a seat into the United Nations Security Council. We have accepted, even without permanent veto power, we must be a permanent member in the UN Security Council. Otherwise, as an Asian representative, we have gone there several times. And we are also asking for membership in the NSG, the Nuclear Supplier Group. We have already been accepted into G20. So now situation is different. But when India started, it had a huge, what you call, status deficit. We overcame that status deficit by 2-3 things. One of the things was to mobilize the Afro-Asian countries. And that mobilization became very critical because it was almost what you call aggregating the power of the powerless. And that became what you call the non-aligned movement or the Afro-Asian movement which was there. And India was leading it. So India had its own influence despite the fact that it was not there in the international organizational setup or hierarchy as it is. But we had tremendous influence amongst the developing countries of Africa and Asia. And secondly, the rivalry between the great powers was such that they were forced into a situation where they needed somebody's help to communicate, to bring about some stability and peace and order at the international level. And this is where India also exercised and played a very important, what you call the peacekeeping role. And two instances are very important, which we must keep it in mind. One was in Korea, the other was in Indochina. And both in Korea and Indochina, the great powers, both the Western Bloc as also the Soviet bloc, wanted India to be there and play the role of mitigating some of the tensions which were coming out of the Cold War and extensions there. Now, these are the 4 deficits, and if you see the Indian foreign policy's evolution, all the efforts of the Indian state have been to overcome these deficits, and we have very significantly moved ahead in overcoming these deficits if you see the manifestations of foreign policy. So out of these deficits, we had core concerns. Out of these deficits, what is it which we wanted in the world? And I think first core concern of India was to have a stable and secure international order. And this stable and secure international order was of great significance for us. You would recall historically that India was in the dragged into both the wars, but by the colonial decision makers, and we had seen the disadvantages of being dragged into the war. That was one of the reasons why we wanted non-alignment, no association, no involvement with any of the great powers so far as military conflicts were concerned, so far as their own conflicts were concerned. And we wanted a stable and peaceful world order in which countries like India and many other developing countries could progress without any hindrance, without any problem. The second was core concern of India's foreign policy was to ensure a friendly, stable and democratic neighborhood. Now, the neighborhood was defined much against India's comfort and India's convenience. If you see South Asia, which we call today, it was one homogeneous economic space, one homogeneous socio-cultural space, one even by and large homogeneous one political order. You would recall that Myanmar and Sri Lanka were at some stages even part of the British Indian administration, and they were closely identified with each other. And suddenly we find that in 1947, South Asia stood divided. In this eco-space, which was there geostrategically, economically, socially, culturally, one huge group of people were divided by political boundaries, and the sovereign lines were drawn between them, creating what you call India's neighborhood. So what were India's parts really became India's neighbors. Though you can say that countries like Nepal were always technically independent, but the engagement and connectivity at various levels, not physical connectivity alone, but political, social, economic, strategic connectivity was so close that this one whole area became. Now this therefore was a part of India in a strategic sense, part of the subcontinent in a strategic sense, the whole neighborhood. And that neighborhood had to be stable and peaceful for India's own progress and own influence. We also wanted a preference. India has never pushed for it, but preference has been that India is a democratic country, and therefore we want to have democratic systems around it. The ideological homogeneity, ideological harmony is critical in terms of having neighborhood relations. So we have, second concern is that India has always wanted to have a friendly democratic neighborhood. The third major concern of India is the buildup of capabilities. As I said, we had these deficits with us, and one of the way to overcome these deficits were to build our capabilities, economic, human, technological, and military. And for that, we were willing to do anything in terms of gearing up our efforts, in terms of establishing our relations. I remember in 1949, when Nehru had the first visit with the United States, one of the consultations which he had with his close colleagues like Krishna Menon and others was to say that how should we approach the United States. And his main thrust on this was that for approaching United States, we should almost have an alliance-like relationship to build our economic, military, and technological capabilities. So this was a driving force for India's foreign policy from the beginning, that we must engage with the world in a manner where our capabilities became sounder and stronger. And lastly, there was an effort to attain what you call and to be acknowledged that India was a major Asian and global player. And this is again, as I said, we started engaging with Asia in a very significant manner. And one of the significant areas in which India started mobilizing the Afro-Asian countries was to support their independence and freedom movements. Two examples are very critical here. One is of Indonesia, and the second one is of Myanmar. Myanmar was being affected by the war going on in China and also the ethnic conflicts inside. And Myanmar was not having much of a support and much of an assistance from anywhere else. India came, organized the Commonwealth support for Myanmar and helped it to stabilize. So much so that UNU almost said that without India we would not have been continuing as an independent and a respectful, dignified nation. So it was acknowledged. The second more critical case was that of Indonesia. And in case of Indonesia, the Dutch struggle, Dutch were not releasing Indonesia. And we had a close relationship with leadership like Sukarno. Biju Patnaik played a very important role in linking up with Indonesia. And we organized an international conference, which really had an impact on Indonesia's independence struggle, and we played a role. So here in Asia, we emphasized on this independence aspect. In Africa, we fought against the racial exploitation and racial discrimination with the South African case. So you find that for seeking an engagement with Asia and Africa, we had picked up very critical issues of survival of the Asian countries, of the African countries, and wanted to support them. This was largely because to get a respectable place in Asia and also respectable place in other countries. And I mentioned earlier about the Korean and Indochina conflict, where we participated for building peace and keeping the rival forces apart. So these are the four core concerns, I would say. These are the four core concerns which we must keep it in mind, have always driven India's foreign policy during the earlier period. And to a very large extent, these are the four concerns which even continue to drive India's foreign policy today. We want an international order. We want a friendly and stable and democratic neighborhood. We want to build our capabilities, our comprehensive national power, and we want to play a major role in shaping Asian relations and global relations. Therefore, India is struggling to have its links with Afro-Asian countries from the very beginning of its own foreign policy. I think it is this struggle which has now acquired a very critical significance in terms of what we call a new concept of the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is neighborhood or extended neighborhood of India, and in this extended neighborhood in Indo-Pacific, we have had old cultural and political links with all these countries. We have built up very powerful economic links with all these countries, and we have tried to ensure that our engagement with the Asian and African countries is of kind of a win-win situation, where they also get benefit out of our engagement and we also get benefit out of our engagement with them. So the old core concerns are not really old in the sense that they have continued to spill over into the present context and acquired a new meaning and new definition. And this new meaning and new definition has assisted India in a very significant manner in order to being demanded by many of these Asian and African countries to come and play a role in this. And that is where the significance of our relationship with Asian and African countries continue to be relevant, continue to be of importance in the projection of India's foreign policy. And lastly, I would say that building comprehensive national power is, no foreign policy can succeed if you don't have capabilities in the economic field and in the military field, in the technological field and in terms of human resources. So on all these four fronts, we have to step up our own capabilities. And once we look at this vaccine diplomacy, for instance, that today we are in a position to supply vaccines to the whole world. And that creates a lot of clout for India in terms of, similarly, even to many of the neighbors, the health services, they come to India for hospitals, surgeries, medical treatment. Now these capabilities have technological capabilities. US IT industry will face a serious problem if Indians did not went and work there. So these are your technical capabilities which have been built up by the institution. Economic growth, we have to recapture it. The corona period has shattered it badly, but whatever happens, unless we have comprehensive national power in which we can project our military capabilities and economic capabilities abroad in a very significant manner, the foreign policy would not succeed. Therefore, these three areas of managing great powers, managing our neighbors, and managing our own comprehensive national power are critical to the success of any foreign policy. By and large, India is doing very well. There are areas of caution and concern where we must take note of, as I said, spillover of the domestic politics, or sometimes neighbors getting alienated from us, sometimes we being forced to have a resort to, like in Galwan and Ladakh, a military face-off. These are the issues which will tax our foreign policy, which will burden our foreign policy in a different way, and we have to find out reasonable answers to them. Thank you very much.